Captain Slow just dropped $2.5 million on a car that can't even hit 60 miles per hour. But here's the kicker. James May's car collection isn't about speed at all. While most folks know him as the methodical host from Top Gear and the Grand Tour, real car guys know him as the man with possibly the most eclectic taste in automobiles on the planet. From a $1.2 million Rolls-Royce that he claims is perfectly awful to a Ferrari he bought just to prove Jeremy Clarkson wrong, we're diving into James May's incredible garage. And wait until you see number 4. It's a prototype that even its own manufacturer forgot existed. This isn't just a car collection. This is what happens when you give an engineering nerd unlimited funds and a wicked sense of humor. Number 15. 1963 Chevrolet Corvette split window. Let's start with what James calls America's only proper sports car. This isn't just any split window. It's one of only 199 built with the rare Z06 package and fuel injection. May says he bought it because it proves Americans can do sophistication when they occasionally choose to stop being silly. The 327 cubic inch L84 V8 makes 360 horsepower through Rochester fuel injection that May describes as surprisingly logical for something American. The split window design, which lasted only 1 year, is what he calls a perfect example of form over function, which makes absolutely no sense and is therefore perfectly American. May found this Corvette in Montana, where it had been stored since 1975 by a rancher who used to race it on the weekends. During restoration, they discovered it was one of the cars used for dealer training, complete with the original Chevrolet training film still in the trunk. May insist on keeping the original fuel injection system, even though modern carburetors would be more reliable, because that would be missing the point entirely. Number 14. 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda convertible. Here's what May calls America's greatest act of automotive lunacy. This isn't just any Cuda. It's one of only 14 Hemi convertibles built in 1970, and one of just 4 with a 4-speed manual. May bought it because, in his words, it's the automotive equivalent of bringing a nuclear weapon to a knife fight, which is the most American thing imaginable. The 426 Hemi V8 is what May describes as Chrysler's middle finger to common sense. Officially rated at 425 horsepower, but May says that number is about as honest as a politician's expense report. The real output is closer to 500 horsepower, all running through a Hurst pistol grip shifter that May claims requires the forearm strength of a professional arm wrestler to operate properly. The story of how May acquired this car is pure comedy. He found it in a Wisconsin barn, where it had been hidden since 1974 because the original owner's wife thought he'd sold it. The owner would sneak out to the barn every Sunday after church to start it up, telling his wife he was checking on the livestock. During restoration, they found his handwritten logs of every secret visit, along with empty bottles of bourbon hidden in the spare tire well. May's restoration approach was typically obsessive. He spent 2 years just researching the correct shade of plum-crazy purple, eventually tracking down the original DuPont paint mixer who worked at the Lynch Road assembly plant. The man, now in his 90s, still had his original mixing formulas written in a notebook. May paid him to recreate the exact paint, a process that took 6 months and cost more than most new cars. Number 13. 1979 Carrera GT3. Here's where Captain Slow proves he's not so slow after all. This isn't just any 911. It's one of only 20 right-hand drive GT3s imported to the UK, and May bought it for what he calls purely scientific reasons. The scientific reason? To prove that modern Porsches aren't actually faster than old ones around the Nürburgring, if you know what you're doing. The 3.6-liter flat 6 makes 380 horsepower, but May says that's irrelevant. What matters is the way it communicates with the driver, like a German engineer whispering in your ear, as he puts it. No power steering, no ABS, not even a radio. Just pure, undiluted driving experience wrapped in Guard's red paint. May found this car in a Sheffield garage, where it had been stored by a dentist who got scared of its reputation. During restoration, they discovered it was actually used as a development car for the GT3 program, evidenced by the factory test tags still attached to the suspension components. Even has the original break-in instructions written in German on a tag under the hood. The restoration was done by the same team that originally built GT3s, with May documenting every step for what he calls historical accuracy. He even tracked down the original test driver, who remembered this specific car because it was the one that didn't try to kill you. Number 12. 1963 Ferrari 250 GTE. Now, this is special. May's first Ferrari, bought specifically because Clarkson said the 250 GTE was the worst Ferrari ever made. May spent 2 years restoring it just to prove him wrong, and in typical May fashion, wrote a 12,000-word essay about why it's actually the most important Ferrari ever built. The 3.0-liter Colombo V12 makes 240 horsepower through 6 Weber carburetors that May says needs more maintenance than a British Royal. But that's not why he loves it. He says the car represents Ferrari's transition from pure racing company to luxury manufacturer, the moment when they realized people might want to bring along their children and luggage. The car came with a complete history file, including service records from Enzo Ferrari's personal mechanic. During restoration, May discovered that this was one of the development cars for Ferrari's first air conditioning system, which he says works about as well as you'd expect from an Italian car of the 60s. May's restoration approach was typically methodical. He cataloged every single part, created detailed diagrams of how everything fit together, and wrote what he calls a workshop manual for people with OCD. The result? A car that's probably better documented than any other 250 GTE in existence. Number 11. 1969 Ford Mustang Boss 429. What May calls America's answer to a question nobody asked. This Boss 429 is one of only 859 built, and May bought it specifically because Jeremy Clarkson said American muscle cars were rubbish. The car still has its original NASCAR-derived engine that May says makes about as much sense as using a sledgehammer to make tea. The 429 cubic inch V8 makes what May describes as enough power to alter the Earth's rotation. Officially rated at 375 horsepower, but May insists that's about as accurate as a chocolate teapot. The engine is so big, Ford had to modify the shock towers and move the battery to the trunk just to make it fit. May calls it gloriously, unnecessarily excessive. He found this car in Arizona, where it had been parked since 1974 because the original owner couldn't afford the fuel bills. During restoration, they discovered it was one of the development cars used for testing the engine package, with original Ford engineers' notes still scribbled inside the trunk lid about various technical adjustments. Number 10. 1959 Bentley S2 Continental. This is what May calls the car that time forgot to ruin. One of only 388 S2 Continentals ever built, and possibly the only one ordered with both the picnic tables and the experimental aluminum radiator. May says it represents the last gasp of proper British luxury before accountants got involved. Under that endless hood sits a 6.2-liter V8 that May describes as adequate. Makes about 200 horsepower. Bentley never officially quoted power figures, saying simply that it was sufficient. The whole car weighs nearly 3 tons, but May insists that that's part of its charm. The interior uses 17 different types of wood and enough leather to clothe the small village. The car's history is pure British aristocracy. Originally owned by a lord who only used to drive it to his London club for lunch, complete with handwritten notes about which parking attendants could be trusted with the keys. May found it in a country house garage, covered in dust, but completely original. During what May calls sympathetic recommissioning rather than restoration, they discovered the car had been used for secret testing of Rolls-Royce's first aluminum radiator design. The original engineer's notes were still in the glove box, along with temperature logs from testing in the south of France. Number 9. 1963 Studebaker Avanti R2. Here's what May calls America's greatest moment of clarity before the madness of muscle cars. This isn't just any Avanti, it's one of only 46 R2 models built with a factory supercharged engine and 4-speed manual transmission. May insists he bought it because it's the car that proves Americans can do sophistication when they're not obsessed with hamburgers and V8s, even though, ironically, it has a V8. The supercharged 289 cubic inch V8 makes what May describes as a surprisingly gentlemanly 289 horsepower. The Paxton supercharger, which May loves explaining to anyone within earshot, was decades ahead of its time. It's like finding out your grandfather invented the internet, he says. The Americans had this technology sorted, while the Europeans were still fiddling about with carburetors and excuses. The history of this particular car reads like a Hollywood script. Originally ordered by a California aerospace engineer who specified every possible performance option, including the rarely seen factory tachometer and the Super Sport package. May discovered it in a Palm Springs garage, where it had been stored since 1975, alongside classified documents about rocket engines. The owner apparently used to drive it to and from top-secret missile testing sites. During what May calls archaeological restoration, they found the original build sheets still tucked into the headliner, along with a handwritten note from Andy Granatelli himself about the supercharger boost settings. The car even came with its original test run timing slips from Bonneville, where it had been clocked at 168 miles per hour, a record for a stock production car at the time. Number 8. 1985 Ferrari 308 GTB QV. This is the car May bought specifically to prove that Magnum PI actually had good taste. It's one of the last carbureted 308s built, and May insists it's the precise moment where Ferrari remembered how to build proper sports cars again. The QV stands for Quattro Valvole, 4 valves per cylinder, which May will explain to anyone who stands still long enough. The 2.9-liter V8 makes 240 horsepower through 4 Weber downdraft carburetors that May says require more attention than a newborn baby. But he loves the mechanical nature of it all, the way you have to warm it up properly, the way the carbs need constant adjustment, and the way it makes you work for every mile. The car's history is fascinating. It was originally owned by a Swiss banker who only drove it on sunny Sundays, keeping a meteorological log to prove it never saw rain. May found it with just 12,000 original miles, complete with every piece of paper Ferrari ever supplied with it. During what May calls mechanical recommissioning, they found the original factory test sheets still in the tool roll, showing this car actually produced 7 more horsepower than standard on the dyno. He keeps the documentation in a climate-controlled safe and has written a 5,000-word article about why it matters. Number 7. 1977 Triumph Dolomite Sprint. Now here's what May calls the thinking man's BMW. This isn't just any Dolomite Sprint. It's the actual development car used for British Leyland's racing program, complete with experimental aluminum head and special competition-spec Weber carburetors. May says it's proof that British Leyland occasionally got things magnificently right. The 2.0-liter 16-valve engine was revolutionary for its time. The world's first mass-produced 16-valve 4-cylinder. It makes 127 horsepower when it's running right, which May admits is approximately 3 Thursdays per month. But he loves it because it represents British engineering at its most ambitious, clever, complicated, and slightly unreliable. May discovered this car in a Birmingham lockup, where an ex-British Leyland engineer had stored it since 1980. It came with all the original development paperwork, including hand-drawn designs for the 16-valve head and notes from engineers complaining about management decisions. During restoration, they found rally pace notes still tucked under the carpet. The restoration was done with what May calls archaeological precision. Every original British Leyland production fault was carefully preserved because, according to him, they're part of the car's soul. He even tracked down the original development team's tea lady, who remembered this car because it was the only one that didn't leak oil on her floor. Number 6. 1969 Lamborghini Espada. Here's what May describes as the car Lamborghini built when they temporarily went sane. One of only 176 Series 1 cars, and the only one originally delivered in what May calls the worst color Lamborghini ever conceived, a sort of metallic brown that he absolutely adores. He bought it because, in his words, it's the supercar for people who've read too many books. The 4.0-liter V12 makes 325 horsepower through 6 Weber carburetors that May says requires the patience of a saint and the wallet of a sheik. But it's not just about the power. It's about the fact that this was Lamborghini's idea of a family car. 4 seats, a proper boot, and a V12 engine. May calls it perfectly rational madness. The car's history reads like a comedy script. It was originally owned by an Italian professor of philosophy who wrote a 300-page thesis about why it was the perfect expression of automotive art. May found it in Milan, complete with the original thesis, which he's had translated and keeps in the glove box. During restoration, they discovered this was one of the development cars for Lamborghini's first air conditioning system, which May describes as working exactly as well as you'd expect from an Italian car of the 60s designed by people who'd never experienced heat. Number 5. 1973 Alfa Romeo GTV 2000. Here's what May calls the only car that makes complete sense while being totally irrational. This particular GTV is one of the rare European spec models with a high compression engine and special lightweight body panels. May says he bought it because every proper petrol head needs at least one Alfa that's trying to kill them. The 2.0-liter twin cam makes 130 horsepower through a pair of Del Orto carburetors that May claims need to be synchronized with the precision of an atomic clock. The engine has to be warmed up properly, the gearbox needs to be treated with respect, and the electrics, well, May says they work in accordance with Italian national principles of occasional functionality. The history file is pure Italian drama. Originally owned by a Rome orchestra conductor who used it to race between performances, complete with sheet music still stuffed in the glove box. May found it in a Florence workshop, where it had been under restoration for 15 years because, in his words, the mechanic kept getting distracted by other projects and wine. During what May calls therapeutic restoration, they discovered this was one of the test cars for Alfa's experimental electronic ignition system, which was abandoned because it worked too reliably and wasn't Italian enough. He kept the prototype parts in a display case and runs the car on standard points because that's how Alfa intended it to suffer. Number 4. 1968 Ford GT40 MK3. Now, this is special. One of only 7 road-going GT40s ever built, and the only one fitted with the experimental air conditioning system that Ford developed but never put into production. May calls it the car that proves Americans can build a proper sports car when they're properly motivated by revenge. The 289 cubic inch V8 makes 306 horsepower, which May insist is exactly enough to be terrifying. Unlike the race versions, this road car has leather seats, carpeting, and that experimental air conditioning system that he says works about as well as you'd expect from something designed in the 1960s to cool a car with a race engine in it. May found this car in pieces, scattered between 3 collections. The engine was in California, being used as a coffee table display. The body was in a barn in Kent, England, and the transmission turned up at an auction in Belgium. During restoration, they discovered that this was the development car for Ford's stillborn GT40 road car program. The restoration took 4 years and cost more than a new Ferrari. Every part had to be verified by Ford's archives department, and May insisted on keeping all the experimental bits, including an early attempt at power steering that he describes as either not working at all or trying to kill you. Number 3. 1963 Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud 3. Here's what May describes as the last car built by craftsmen who didn't care about cost. This particular Cloud is one of only 12 built with the experimental aluminum body panels and what May calls the most gloriously unnecessary option list ever created. He bought it because, in his words, sometimes you need a car that makes absolutely no sense. The 6.2-liter V8 makes what Rolls-Royce would describe as adequate power. Through a transmission so smooth, May says you can't tell if it's running unless you check your bank account draining. Every panel was hand-formed by craftsmen who spent their entire careers working on just one part of the car. The wood trim took 3 months to finish in 1963. The car's history is pure British aristocracy. Originally ordered by a lord who specified 26 unique features, including a drinks cabinet that May swears was designed to hold exactly 1 day's worth of gin for a British peer. During restoration, they found the original craftsman's signatures hidden inside the door panels, along with handwritten notes about proper panel beating techniques. May's restoration approach was typically obsessive. He tracked down the son of the original wood trimmer, who still had his father's tools and templates. The leather was sourced from the same herd that supplied the original hide. May actually visited the farm to verify this. He even had the carpet hand-woven to the original specification. Number 2. 1957 BMW 507. This is what May calls the car that nearly bankrupted BMW, and now I know why. One of only 252 ever built, this particular 507 is the actual car used for BMW's European press launches. May says he bought it because sometimes beauty is worth more than common sense. The 3.2-liter V8 makes 150 horsepower, which May insists is entirely irrelevant. What matters, he says, is the sound it makes, like Wagner conducting an orchestra of precision machinery. Every panel was hand-formed. Every component was assembled with a kind of care that nearly put BMW out of business. The result? A car so expensive when new that even Elvis Presley struggled to afford one. The history file reads like a who's who of European motorsport. Used as a press car, it was driven by Juan Manuel Fangio, Sterling Moss, and even tested by automotive journalist Paul Ferrer. May found it in Switzerland, where it had been stored since 1975 by a collector who never registered it for road use. The restoration took 5 years and cost more than his house. Every single component was either restored or recreated using original BMW blueprints. May even tracked down one of the original assembly line workers, now in his 90s, who remembered this specific car because it was the one that made the perfect sound. And at number 1, 1967 Ferrari 330 GTC. And here it is, folks, what May calls the best car Ferrari ever made, specifically because it's the least Ferrari-like Ferrari. This isn't just any 330 GTC. It's one of only 3 built with the experimental air conditioning system and special sound insulation package. May says it's the Ferrari for people who think Ferraris are a bit vulgar. The 4.0-liter Colombo V12 makes 300 horsepower through 6 Weber carburetors that May says need to be tuned with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker who's had exactly 2 glasses of wine. But he insists the power isn't the point. This car, he says, represents the moment when Ferrari realized not everyone wanted to pretend they were racing in Monza. The car's history is fascinating. Originally ordered by an Italian industrialist who specified it in the least Ferrari-like color possible, a subtle shade of gray that May describes as perfect for avoiding attention, which rather defeats the point of having a Ferrari. During restoration, they found the original factory test driver's notes complaining that it was too comfortable to be a proper Ferrari. May's approach to ownership is typically methodical. He maintains a logbook documenting every journey, every fuel stop, every oil temperature reading. The car lives in a climate-controlled garage, but unlike most collectors, May insists on driving it regularly. He's even written a 15,000-word essay about why it's the perfect car for going to the supermarket. Well, folks, there you have it. James May's incredible collection. From Italian thoroughbreds to British eccentrics, each car tells a story of engineering, innovation, and what happens when you give a mechanical perfectionist unlimited funds and a dry sense of humor. You know what makes these cars really special? They're not just garage queens. May drives every single one of them, usually while explaining exactly why it's technically fascinating in ways that would put most people to sleep. But that's exactly why we love him. He's the only guy who can make a car's manufacturing tolerances sound as exciting as a lap time. The total value? Well, May says that's entirely irrelevant and probably depressing. But what matters is that each of these cars represents something special. A moment in automotive history when engineers and designers were allowed to pursue perfection, regardless of cost or practicality. Remember what May says about collecting cars. The perfect car collection should be like a great library, full of books you actually want to read, not just the ones that look impressive on the shelf. This is Vintage Vehicles, reminding you that sometimes the best stories in automotive history come from the guys who can explain exactly why they're technically brilliant. We'll see you next time, folks. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to keep seeing the world's most fascinating car collections.